And regarding introducing solids,
Uh-huh.
what do you advise parents about the stages, when to introduce, what to introduce, which
Uh-huh.
methodology to follow? We have
Uh-huh.
different methodologies and people are often fighting about who is right, who is not,
Yeah.
whether it's puree or pieces.
Uh-huh. Well, it's interesting because, of course, all around the world, people do things very differently. I don't think it's worth fighting about myself, but the World Health Organization recommends starting solids when the baby's around 6 months old, and that's a good age because the baby can sit up, the baby can reach out and pick up things and put them in his mouth. The baby is probably ready to get teeth fairly soon, so that is a good time to begin. The As far as the purees are concerned, I mean, a lot of that's a matter of preference, but we have a method of introducing solids that's called baby-led weaning that comes from the UK. And in the UK, the word weaning refers to starting solids. In the US, weaning usually refers to the end of breastfeeding. So this is a little different terminology, but that in using the baby-led weaning approach, that involves putting the food in front of the baby and letting the baby strictly be the one to either eat it or not eat it, letting the baby decide. Not all parents are comfortable doing that, but the research on it actually is pretty clear that that's a perfectly fine way to introduce solids. So again, parents get to make these decisions. I would say probably the one thing you'd want to avoid is to like overfeed the baby, because that would be a risk factor if you're spoon feeding purees, because they tell us as adults that we should eat slowly so that our appetite control mechanism kicks in. So in other words, if we eat very fast, we could end up overeating very easily because we don't realize that we're full. And I would say the same thing is true for babies, that we don't want to just keep shoveling it in until the baby is over full. You'd want to take it a little bit slowly. So if they did decide to use purees in a spoon, that would be my recommendation.
Mm-hmm. I think this is some sort of part of anxiety of young parents,
Mm-hmm.
especially when I'm afraid my child is not eating enough.
Yeah.
So I want to make sure that,
Yeah.
for example, the norm is like 100 grams of something of puree.
Yeah.
So I want to make
Yes.
sure
Yeah.
that all 100 grams are there.
Yeah,
And
you look at the early, like from 6 to 9 months is a period of time where you're just introducing this new way of eating. I don't think you need to get stressed out about it. There's a wonderful book that I just love by a Spanish pediatrician, Dr. Carlos Gonzalez. It's called My Baby Won't Eat. And it addresses that exactly the anxiety that you're talking about. And he describes, how babies are very different. They grow differently, and how this fixation on exact amounts of foods is just, it takes some of the joy, I think, out of early parenting. It's easy to feel anxious when you have a baby, because I think for all of us, when we have our first child, I think we all wonder, are we really up for this? Are we really going to be the kind of good parent that we need to be? There's a lot of anxiety there, that feeling of responsibility for another human being. But on the other hand, it's not helpful for us to get too worked up about things that aren't ultimately going to make a difference long term. And I would say, getting overly stressed about solids is probably in that category.
And also we have people who say that children, babies, they don't eat adult food until they stop breastfeeding, because
Oh,
breastfeeding
huh.
doesn't allow them to get interest for solids. What do you reply to such people?
Well, we actually have research that shows that nursing babies have an easier time starting solids than babies who are formula fed. And one of the reasons for that is because the flavors of the food that the nursing parent eats actually go into the milk. And so they found that, for example, if the mother eats carrots, that the nursing baby is going to be more likely to accept carrots happily, compared to a formula fed baby, or even a nursing baby whose mother doesn't eat carrots. So it's definitely a wrong assumption about that. And in fact, what the World Health Organization recommends is definitely continuing to nurse until at least the baby's 2 years old. So the idea that you should stop nursing when the baby gets solids is not really based on any solid information at all.
Yes, lots of parents are concerned about the quality of our food nowadays, about fruits and vegetables, that they are not, they cannot afford buying organic. And they believe that the packed bottles with purees produced by big companies, they are better in quality than the food that we buy in supermarkets.
That sounds like they've been taking the marketing of those products a little too seriously. I'm sure that's what the companies want them to think. So obviously they're very successful at marketing that. But certainly fresh fruits and vegetables are always going to be more nutritious than fruits and vegetables in a jar. The closer the foods are to their natural state, the more the nutrition is intact. So, certainly washing the fruits and vegetables before giving them to baby is good, but I think that, again, it sounds like the marketing has been very effective, but it's not necessarily accurate.
Yes. Nancy, let's talk a little bit about weaning in the sense of weaning. Some mothers believe that they need to stop earlier because it's easier, that it's easier to stop before the age of 1. Other parents argue, saying that we need to stop later so that the child understands what is going on.
Yeah.
And we have lots of people who are lost and very stressed because they don't sleep, they don't have rest, they are eager to wean and they don't manage to wean properly. They meet this resistance of a child and they don't know what to do with it.
Right. Well, as far as weaning properly, I would say about the only thing you could really do that is, more negative would be to do it suddenly, just to stop suddenly. That's bad, I think, for both the parent and child. I mean, sometimes it's necessary in a health crisis, for example, but if it's not necessary, no matter what age the child is, you want to wean gradually, because if you do it gradually, then the parent isn't going to experience any pain. There's going to be no increased risk of mastitis. And then it's going to be an easier experience for the child. I happen to believe you can wean at any age and make it a positive experience. And in my book for parents, Breastfeeding Made Simple, we have a whole chapter on weaning. So, I understand the rationale about the idea if you do it earlier, it's easier. But on the other hand, parents are smarter than 1-year-olds. And there's a lot of ways they can plan ahead and make the weaning a positive experience, even if the child isn't willing. And I think the trick to that is to make sure that you make changes in the environment and in your routine before the child asks to nurse. So, like, for example, you think about when does the child usually ask? If you're sitting in a certain chair at home, you don't sit in that chair. If the child asks to nurse less when you're out, let's say at a playground, you spend a lot of time out for a while, as you're cutting down on the number of nursing sessions. So the goal of a positive weaning is to try to reduce the number of nursings before the child asks to nurse. So I agree. Once the child asks, then you've got a fight on your hands usually. So the idea is to avoid that. But again, parents are smarter than 1-year-olds or even 2-year-olds or even 3-year-olds for that matter. And so there's lots of ways to do it. So in my books, I talk about the various ways. As children get older, sometimes if you're 2 or older, you might say, well, you could only nurse till the end of this song, and maybe they'll sing a song to them, so they can shorten the nursing sessions. One of the hallmarks of weaning is don't offer and don't refuse. And that's, if you think about that, it's a way to make it more positive. But you're not offering them. Another, I think, really important aspect of a positive weaning is to make sure the child has plenty of food and drinks, because sometimes children ask to nurse because they're hungry or thirsty. So if you can make sure, like ahead of time before they ask, that they have plenty of food and drink, that's going to make a difference. Sometimes getting the partner involved is really helpful, especially when you get to those nursing sessions at night, or getting up in the morning. The partner could have breakfast ready right away instead of the child nursing as the first thing. So there's lots of different ways to plan a weaning, even for an older child, like say even a 2 or 3-year-old, that can make it more positive. So the idea is to find things that the child will enjoy even more than nursing. and giving them a lot of that while you're cutting back. But the idea also is to do it gradually. So, it could take a period of several weeks to go from full nursing to no nursing at all.
If I may intervene, I just
Sure.
realized that it was really positive thing for me while I was weaning to have no specific expectations around the deadline. So like, I want to wean in 2 weeks strictly.
Yeah.
So
You
it
don't
really
need to
helped
put,
me to be flexible and
yeah,
find the way.
absolutely. You don't want to put extra pressure on yourself during the time of a transition like that. If the child gets sick, for example, you probably want to postpone it. There are situations where it would make sense to maybe put it off a little bit. Some children are going to be more ready at certain ages than others, and it'll be very, very easy. With my second child, it was very easy. One night, instead of nursing him to sleep, I said, we were going to do something different. He said, well, could I just put my hand on it? And so I said, sure. So he just put his hand there and he was fine to go to sleep like that. And so, like I say, the idea is to find ways that are acceptable to both the parent and the child, because both the parent and the child are an important part of the nursing relationship. So if a parent feels really strongly that it's time to wean, then, that has to be taken very seriously. But I think the child's preferences and reactions need to be taken into account as well. So it's not a negative experience.
Yes, it has to be an experience and in the process, I believe.
It's a process. Yeah, it's a transition. I mean, think of it as any transition you might do with your child. I've heard women say that they don't want to nurse because they don't want to have to deal with weaning. And I mean, that's just that's just silly because it's you have so many transitions that you help your child through, and the idea is to find ways to make it easier for them, ways for them to cope with the transitions in a positive way.
I wanted, if you don't mind, to come back a little bit to the topic of sleep, because I think sleep is sort of one of the crucial points
it
for many
is.
parents. And often, as you mentioned, it is assumption that if I will stop breastfeeding, I will sleep better. Which might be not the case and actually is not proven by the science. So what are your, and still at the certain age, let's say maybe after 1 year old, or I don't know what age is appropriate, it's okay to start to, probably use different strategies during the night, not to breastfeed, but, maybe hug, maybe something else instead of breastfeeding. So you're basically not breastfeeding constantly and you use different. So what would be your advices to parents to start breaking this breastfeeding pattern during the night, and from which age it's appropriate?
Yeah, well, I would say, after 1 year, if a parent wants to do that, one thing might be like if the child is very close to them at night, it might be to move the child further away, into a different room or whatever. And then, maybe stay with them while they're going to sleep. So, like in many families, families who spend some part of the night together aren't always co-sleeping for the whole night. So like you might start, if you had been co-sleeping, you might start by starting the night in another room. And then when the child wakes up, they come in, and that would cut down on it. So, you look at it again, always look at every transition as a process and figure out how much the child can handle, and try and just keep moving in that direction. Would a stuffed animal be helpful? Could they sleep with a sibling? When my second child made the transition into his own room, that made it really easy. The fact that he wasn't alone and he was with his brother, that really was huge. So that transition wasn't difficult at all. He happened to be a child that was very adaptable, which, not all children are. Some are more and some are less adaptable. But maybe again, have the partner get involved, have maybe an older child have a glass of water or a cup of water if it's a smaller child that they can handle, a way for them to get a drink at night. There's lots of different ways to think about it. But I think, maybe putting a little distance between the parents and the child would be a first step for a child older than 1 year.
How do you see the benefit of breastfeeding past the 1 year of age? So we spoke about the short-term benefits that everybody is aware about, doctors and mothers. But what about after the age of 1?
Well, after the age of 1, again, the longer a woman breastfeeds, the better the health effects are for her. But for the baby, actually, we do see a difference in health outcomes for babies older than a year. In other words, those babies are going to get sick less often because the antibodies that are in the milk, they're going to continue to get until they're completely weaned. But for me, and when I talk about a baby who's older than 1, really what I think is most important is that emotional connection that nursing brings. Because when you've got a tiny baby, how much milk they get, making sure they're getting enough and that they're gaining weight well is of course your top priority. But as babies nurse for longer, it becomes something more than just a way to get milk into a baby. It becomes a way to calm and comfort a baby. It was funny because my mother didn't nurse me. As I said, I was bottle fed. And she used to, because I nursed my 3 sons, definitely past 1 year. And she used to think I was being a martyr or something, because I continued nursing. And I never could convince her that it actually made my life as a mother so much easier, because it was so easy to get my sons down for their naps and for bedtime. My husband used to call it knockout drops because they relaxed. The sucking, was so relaxing and soothing to them. As they got closer to age 2, we call it the terrible 2s here in America. It was never terrible for me because whenever they started to get upset and start to get angry, I would lift up my shirt and then immediately they would be fine. They would nurse, they would settle down. I found in so many ways, it made my life as a mother much easier than if I hadn't been nursing.